Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan. Welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today I'm going to be doing what I hope is interesting to some people out there. The title of the video says Canon's Orphan camera, the Canonflex, and sounds kind of like an interesting title, an orphan camera. And what exactly is an orphan camera? And if I were to come up with the definition of an orphaned product, it would have to be something like this, the Canonflex SLR camera. Now, there were a few different variations of this camera produced, and luckily I have 3 variations available here to show you. There was one more, I don't have it on hand, but it's similar to the one which I have right here, the only difference being 1 stop of shutter speed. But basically, these cameras represent pretty much all of the Canonflex line, and they are quite an interesting piece of photographic history, especially for Canon. And it also shows that even a mainstream company, well known for designing high quality precision products, can sometimes make a mistake and end up producing something which people don't really want. So the Canonflex camera was Canon's first SLR camera, and it was released in 1959, around the same time as the Nikon F. Asahi Pentax had already been producing a number of SLR cameras. I think they were on their second or third incarnation of their SLR camera by the time the Canonflex was released. And SLR cameras were obviously the future. That's they were just much superior to the rangefinder cameras, which were the mainly the cameras of most working pros at the time, newspaper photographers, hobbyists, and things like that. The SLR cameras offered a lot of advantages. The number one advantage, of course, being able to actually see what the lens sees when you are taking a photograph. Unfortunately, rather than normally in the old days we used to kind of complain about Japan copying technology from other places, and by the 1950s Japan was no longer doing that. At least when it came to cameras, they were pretty much developing their own technology, and whatever copying was going on in the industry was usually against each other, copying each other's products. And it seems that Canon decided not to copy anyone and to go on their own judgment when they designed the Canonflex RP. And unfortunately, their judgment wasn't very good, and not so many of these cameras were produced, and after a short production run of a few years, they were abandoned, and at that point they began to take a closer look at what the competition was selling and decided to, rather than to innovate, to copy and try to make more popular cameras based upon the experience of their rivals. And after they did that, they were much more successful. That's not to say that the Canonflex cameras were inherently bad. They were actually very well made cameras, very reliable, and much more so than some of the other cameras which were being marketed at that time. As much as I like the old Pentax cameras, they have not endured through the years as well as these Canonflex cameras. It's really hard to find an Asahi Flex camera, Asahi Pentax, or Pentax SP, SL, SV, H1, H2, S1, S2. There were lots and lots of them made. And unfortunately, not many of those are still working so well today. They suffer from issues like rotting shutters and shutter curtain ribbons and deterioration of the prisms and things like that. Something which, by and large, the Canonflex cameras seem immune to. And it's very rare that I come across one of these old cameras which has been sitting in someone's closet for 50 years and attempt to wind it, and it doesn't actually work. These are extremely well-made, high-quality cameras. So why weren't they a hit? Let's go ahead and take a look. We'll take a look at the first one here. This particular Canonflex is the R2000 model, which is the second variation. The original Canonflex looked just like this. The 2000 denotes that it has a 1/2000th of a second top shutter speed, which was remarkably fast for an SLR camera of that time. But other than that, it's the same as the earlier camera. Basically, the biggest thing which interfered with the success of these cameras was the winding system. If you look on the bottom here, you see we have this thing which folds down and allows you to wind the film and charge the shutter. And Canon decided to go with this system because it was popular with newspaper and press photographers, and they were selling a lot of these trigger wind bottom plates for their rangefinder cameras, and other makers were doing it too. Leica's cameras, which were on the market at the time, they were also selling trigger winders for them. And unfortunately, what works for professional press photographers doesn't necessarily work for amateur or ordinary people. And a lot of people found that this trigger system, it worked well enough, it wound the film quickly, but one thing that was very difficult to do if you were using this system was use a tripod on this camera. And there's a tripod mount located way off over to the side here, but even if you use a tripod mount which is kind of out of the way of the trigger winder, it still gets in the way a little bit. And also, when it sits way off to the side, the Canonflex is not a lightweight camera, and unless you have a pretty sturdy tripod and a really good tripod head which you can lock down tight, the camera is likely to tilt a little bit as you use it. And most people of that time were not carrying large professional heavy-duty tripods. They were using tripods. I'll go ahead and show the bottom of my Jobo tripod here. Things which were not larger than this, something which you can carry in your camera bag. And you simply couldn't use that kind of tripod with one of these cameras, while it worked perfectly well with everyone else's camera. So that was a big issue. And another issue was the design of the lens. Now, I have this an FD lens mounted to this camera. The original lens was what was called the R series, which is kind of a quirky lens which you can set manually or automatically, and it has two rings here. There's an aperture ring, and then there's a lock or limit ring, something which was introduced in earlier cameras which did not have fully automatic apertures. It was kind of a semi-automatic system. And this is kind of quirky and difficult to use, and Canon was able to get away with these when they changed the lens design to the FL lens and later on to the FD lens. But this was another thing which made operating the camera kind of difficult. And by the time that Canon had introduced this camera with this system, it was pretty much already obsolete. The other makers had already done away with the dual ring system, or what they also called the preset system for the aperture. Now, some cool things about this camera are the removable prism, and if you push the button here, you can slide the prism off. And Canon intended to make a variety of prisms for these cameras so they could be used for things like astrophotography, macro photography, or believe it or not, people were still like to use these cameras for waist level photography, where you simply just look down through the top and you can see the focusing screen there. As I'm looking through the top of the camera right now and I focus it, I can kind of use this. It's a little bit difficult to use in this somewhat dark room, but it is usable. And other makers sold waist level finders for their SLR cameras. But unfortunately, this turned out to be something which didn't work out well. These prisms were expensive to produce, and the mechanism for installing the prism and all that, and it was just really complicated. And when Canon eventually redesigned the Canonflex, they replaced it with this one here, which is basically the same camera but without a removable prism. Everything else on the camera is the same. One thing that the later version didn't come with was the 1/2000th shutter speed. Now, the shutter mechanism on the Canon cameras is quite reliable except at the highest speeds. And the only issue I tend to come across with these cameras when I find them nowadays, and this also applies to the rangefinder cameras, is the fact that often the highest speed, the 1/1000th of a second, doesn't open. And so it works fine from 1/500th of a second all the way down to 1 second. But a lot of these cameras, the 1/1000th speed doesn't work. And that's even more of an issue with the top speed of 1/2000, because that requires more critical adjustment. But a lot of the other things on these cameras are the same. They both accepted the same clip-on meter, which would clip on here and which engaged with the shutter speed dial, which allowed you to have what they call a coupled meter system. And what you would do is using the light meter, as you turn the dial here, it would give you a recommended aperture depending on the film speed you were using. Other quirky things about this camera were that they kind of used the old rangefinder flash system, and there's a socket on the side where you attach a flash bracket, or there was what was called a, they made a flash bracket which mounted to the tripod mount underneath, which was made a little bit more complicated because of this bottom winding design. And it would lock on here and would put the flash over the top of the camera, and it worked quite well on the rangefinder cameras. But by this time, cameras were already coming with a much simpler chute mounted over the top of the prism with either a what they call a hot shoe, an electronic contact on the top, which would allow you to attach a flash without wires, or with a simple flash sync socket with a standard sync cable. So you could use flashes of different brands or whatever. You didn't have to use a dedicated flash. In the case of Canon, you had to use a Canon flash adapter in order for the camera to work. You can kind of squeeze a sync cable in there, but where do you put the flash if you don't have the adapter for it? So that was another thing which made these cameras not sell especially well. Not so many of these were made, and even here in Japan I don't come across a lot of the Canonflex models with the removable prism. I don't come across a lot of the RPs, which was the newer version, and after a short time Canon just kind of dumped this design altogether, and they moved over to the Canonflex. RM, and RM, the R is the designation of this particular model, and M denotes that it has a built-in light meter. And with this camera, no longer did you have to attach a removable light meter to the top. You could simply use a built-in light meter, and there's a light meter scale located here on the top of the camera, which actually works quite well and is very responsive. And one thing I will say about the Canonflex cameras, the light meter in these is generally very reliable, and it's not often that I come across one of these cameras where it doesn't fit. Now, these cameras were all based upon Canon's rangefinder cameras, just like Nikon. A Nikon's F camera is basically just a Nikon S rangefinder camera, which has been re-engineered to put a prism on the top, and with a little bit more space between the lens mount and the film plane, so they can fit in a retrofocus system, in the mirror box. A lot of the stuff on the camera looks the same as on the Canon rangefinder cameras. The opening is the same way, but a little bit easier since they add a little catch there to pop it open. One thing that is different is that the Canon rangefinder cameras, the Canon 7 and the Canon P, which were still in production at the same time as this camera, featured stainless steel shutter curtains, which were colored black, whereas these cameras, the Canonflex series, came with silk shutters. And unfortunately, the silk shutters do tend to get a little deteriorated over time. But as I said toward the beginning of the video, they're much more durable than the shutters made by other makers at the time. Nikon was, of course, using titanium shutters in their F-series cameras, and those are bulletproof and still working well today. It doesn't, as I said, the cloth shutter curtains in these cameras are quite reliable, and I think it's just due to a higher quality silk and a better quality coating over the silk. Now, these cameras here, I have the RP and the RM are the optional cameras. These are the black colored ones, which are kind of the professional version. And I got these mainly to put in my personal collection because the black paint models are quite a bit more rare than the standard ones. The Canonflex RM was a much more popular camera, and Canon did sell quite a few of these, but it never reached anywhere the same level of popularity as, say, Minolta's SR series or any of Nikon's cameras. And eventually, Canon moved away completely from this design, and they started from the ground up and built a more modern SLR camera. And when they did that, they pretty much didn't save anything or use anything from your series, earlier series of Canonflex cameras. Everything was different. And and of course, the rest is history. Eventually, Canon became, I guess, the top SLR camera of working professionals when digital took off. But in their early years, of course, they had a few struggles, and the Canonflex series is one of the greatest examples of these struggles. And fortunately for Canon, they were a big enough company at the time that they didn't lose so much money that it put them out of business. But an interesting thing to think about is when these were being produced, especially the RP and the Canonflex RM. The Canon was still producing its Canon 7 rangefinder camera because that turned out to be still more popular than their SLR cameras. Whereas when the Nikon F came out and the Pentax and other makers brought out their SLR cameras, their rangefinder camera sales pretty much just fell through the floor. But anyway. A few words on collectability of these cameras and what to look for and weaknesses which you can find in them. And when it comes to the black paint cameras, if you're a collector of Canon cameras, make sure that it comes with the original black paint lens. And that's very easy to find the original lens because the bayonet ring on the base here is painted black. It's not silver like on this camera here. So these cameras have some collector value, but they have more collector value if they're just fitted, if they're fitted with the original black lens. The lens variety was rather limited in these cameras. The most common lens is the 50mm f1.8 lens, which both of these cameras are fitted with. The 58mm f1.2 was also an option, and those also came in a black paint version. And also there was a 35mm f2.5 lens, and Canon had a lot of other stuff in the works for these cameras, but these are the lenses you're most likely to find. Personally, I find that the standard 50mm f1.8 lens is a perfectly good performer. It's wonderful, and Canon kind of carried the design into their later FL and FD lenses. The 58mm f1.2 is a really cool lens. It's really quirky. It has interesting effects depending on the lighting and the lens itself. It's one of those lenses which uses the thorium glass, so it yellows over time, and the amount of yellowing in the glass can it's more like golding rather than yellowing. It's more of a gold cast than the yellow cast, and it's not cloudy or milky. It just adds, like if you were to put like a gold, like gold tinted sunglasses. It kind of changes the nature of the photograph. It adds warmth when you're shooting color film. It adds contrast when you're shooting black and white film. And they're really fun lenses to use for interesting photographic effects, and even if you can adapt to use them on digital cameras. But the good thing about those is compared to the other later Canon lenses, the faster ones, they're more of a bargain. You can find them for a lower price. And if you're hunting for one of the older cameras, the Canonflex cameras, I recommend hunting up one of the 58mm f1.2 lenses. And the 35mm f2.5, that's a rather scarce lens, but it's actually a very useful focal length. So if you can find one of those lenses to put on your Canonflex, that's a good option. Unfortunately, lens options on these cameras are limited. You can't use the later lenses on them, unfortunately. I have an FD lens mounted on here, and while it mounts perfectly, the aperture will not stop down if I try to use the lens. So if I'm shooting it wide open at f2, I can take photographs with it, but I can't use any of the other apertures. To do that, I have to use the proper lens. I use this lens because this is one that I really love to have on hand for my my Canon f1. Or actually, I have the camera just because of this lens. This is one of my favorite lenses of all time. So I figured I'd go ahead and put on a different camera just to see how it looked, and it looks very beautiful on this camera. I just wish that I could use this lens on this camera. But anyway, that's it for my I guess review or commentary or small essay on the Canonflex cameras. If any of you have any information about these cameras, or you want to share your experience with them, feel free to do that in the comment section below. And I plan to make some more videos soon. I'll be out of town for the weekend. This weekend is the Jack Russell Terrier Festival, which is being held out in the countryside in Nagano. And as it happens, we have a Jack Russell Terrier, so we're going to be going there to let him play with his distant cousins and relatives and all the people of the Jack Russell Terrier Society here in Japan. And maybe I'll take some photos and video and show those next week when I post my next video. But anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.